You clicked on this video and you probably were wondering, what does he mean by scheduling? In this video, we're going to be going over this concept that I have started implementing in a lot of my deck builds and has really helped me optimize the consistency of my deck, making sure that everything operates the way it's supposed to, and it almost happens in some sort of scheduled manner. I've made a video previously about how important mana curves are, and this is basically that topic times 10. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want you to start thinking of yourself not as a Magic the Gathering player, or a Commander player, or even a board game player. I need you to start thinking that this is a machine that you are operating. It is a machine with 99 cards in it, and a single card that you're guaranteed to play every single game. You are a machine operator, and you have to play the game as such. So, as any other machine operator, you have steps that you need to follow. In order to get the machine or engine or whatever it is up and running and working well, you need to follow a certain amount of steps. Then it's going to be operational, and eventually this machine is going to start functioning on its own, completely autonomous, without you needing to really do anything. And of course, from there, you'll just do some maintenance, and eventually you'll hit your goal, which is winning the game, or doing whatever your deck wants to do. When we think about the concept of scheduling, this is what I'm talking about. You can think of a Magic game in 3 phases: the early game, the mid game, and the late game. In the early game, there's not a lot of interaction actually going around. So what I want you to do is start making sure that your first couple of turns are as consistent as possible. Then you'll go into the mid game, which interaction starts to fly around and people start to find small advantages here and there in order to make their board state a bit more consistent than yours. And then in the late game, the interaction starts to die down just a little bit as people start to assemble their win conditions. Now, depending on what kind of format or what kind of power level you're playing at, these phases start at plenty of different times. But let's take casual to high power casual in mind for this video. In most cases, we can think of the early game in a format like this as the first 4 to 5 turns. Not a lot of interaction is going to be thrown around in these first 4 to 5 turns. So what I need you to do is make sure that your deck is consistent in these turns. In order to correctly portray this and showcase what I mean by this, I'm going to be talking about my Ikra Prava list that I just recently created. This deck wants to do one of 3 things: gain life, go wide, and hit the opponent. So I make sure that on every single one of my turns, 1 through 4, I can do something that does that. At my 1-drop slot, turn 1, I'm only going to have 1 land. In that, I want to find something that's either going to ramp me up for later in the game, or that's going to help me start gaining life that I'm looking for. On turn 2, I'm going to start playing something that's going to make me tokens, or help me pay off from having these tokens and going wide. Turn 3, I'm going to basically do the same thing, except now you start to enter some of the draw support as well. And then on turn 4, we're looking to have something that's going to be a huge payoff, whether that's a token doubler, an extreme ramp piece like Smothering Tithe, or some more life gain. Then at this point, the first 4 turns of the game are over and I'm looking to cast my commander. In most cases, I'm going to be casting Prava, but sometimes I'll cast Ikra depending on if I cast Prava earlier in the game. Now, this deck is a machine. It's looking to do one of those 3 things that we listed earlier, and it's looking to do it as consistently as possible. And my mana curve reflects this. If we look at my mana curve, we can see how many cards I actually have that are going to be in my deck, which shows you that the odds of these being in my opening hand, as well as drawing into them, are going to be huge. So when it comes down to test hands, I typically have at least a 1-drop, 2-drop, or 3-drop, in some cases all 3 of these things, in my opening hand. When this is the case and you have your turns scheduled out properly, a lot of thinking that's required in the game of Magic the Gathering is simply taken away from you. Because you're just operating machine, the machine does what it wants and it does it really well. So you just have to follow what it's giving you. In this case, let's say I play a turn 1 Essence Warden, turn 2 Bitter Blossom, turn 3 Caretaker's Talent, turn 4 a Parallel Lives, and then on turn 5, I cast Prava. I'm now in a great situation. I'm drawing some extra cards, I'm doubling my tokens, I'm making them big, and soon I'll be able to cast Ikra on top of that and start gaining a ton of life. Those are my first 5 turns completely mapped out for me. And you'll find with decks like this, when all your turns are scheduled, that this happens a lot more often than you might think. You've probably found that some of your decks are a bit inconsistent. Sometimes they pop off, other times they don't, which means that the mulligan is a very, very difficult and important part of your gameplay. When you start building decks like this, most hands become keepable, and now it's about finding the nuance of which hands are better than others. Every hand will be keepable, and some will be a bit more optimal than others. But you're doing your due diligence as a machine operator, aka deck builder, to make sure that your deck is outlined as consistently as possible. Let's go over another example. Ikra Prava is a bit more high power, so you might think that, oh, we just have really high quality and expensive cards in there, which is why it's so consistent. But I want to show another deck that is a lot more fun, has a lot more thematic spice going for it, and still does the same thing. This is Felix 5 Boots. Now in the past, this deck was also used as the example for my mana curve video, except this time, Felix has some snakes in his boots. I've always been a fan of snakes in Magic the Gathering. I think it's a really cool tribe, and I decided I wanted to make a deck based around snakes and snake tribal. So what does this deck want to do? Well, it wants to cast snakes that are either unblockable, can get bigger, or have death touch. It wants to cast snakes that have combat damage triggers, and it wants to be aggressive by attacking your opponents. Felix 5 Boots helps us pay off through combat triggers, and snakes typically have a lot of combat trigger payoffs, so they just kind of go hand in hand. Now, here's how we stay consistent. On turn 1, we play one of these snakes that either have death touch or can't be blocked, or we have some sort of ramp. On turn 2, we really make sure, with snakes especially, that this is where you can ramp the best. Coiling Oracle, Steve, Tower Winder, and some of these Orochi cards are really great at ramping on turn 2. Then on turn 3, we're going to start having some of our payoffs. Either these are going to go great with the rest of our snakes, they're going to have combat triggers of their own, or they're just going to be a high quality card that we can cast on turn 3. Then on turn 4, we're going to play one of our mini Biden of Thassa effects. We have 5 of these in the deck, so they're really valuable for us. And they're going to make sure that our unblockable snakes that we cast on turn 1 are now drawing us a card going into turn 5. And then on turn 5, when we cast Felix, they're drawing us 2 cards for every bit of combat damage. So turns 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, casting our commander, are all scheduled out for us. Now it's about just keeping a hand that's going to get us there consistently, and of course building our deck and mana curve around that fact and that game plan. So now that we've gone over exactly what scheduling your deck can look like, we're going to go over the other bits that we don't talk about as much. How many lands should you run in a deck that does this? Well, this is always going to have to do with the amount of ramp that you're able to run, the amount of high mana spells you actually have, and how expensive your commander actually is. In my Felix 5 Boots deck, I don't have nearly as much ramp as my Ikra Prava deck, so I run 38 lands. This is to make sure that I'm almost always guaranteed to have 5 land drops in the first 5 turns, especially if I keep a 3-land hand. With that, in most cases, I am going to have enough lands by turn 5. For Ikra Prava, I have a lot more ramp on turns 1, 2, and even 3, so I only run 35 lands. If I keep a 2-land hand, I have to have some sort of ramp, but in most cases, I'm looking for 3 lands in my opening hand. So that's how I like to find the amount of lands I want to run in decks like this, especially when I build my decks this way. And lastly, you're probably thinking, well, how do we choose interaction with this kind of deck? I like to keep interaction a little bit light in this. These decks are trying to be as streamlined as possible, so we're not really planning on casting any of our interaction until around the mid game. Now, when you have plenty of ways to draw cards, you have plenty of ways to execute your strategy, and you're going to do that consistently, by the time you're in turn 5 or turn 6, you will have drawn into 2 or 3 of your bits of interaction. So we don't need to run as much. When I recommend the amount of interaction that people run, generic numbers are nice. In this case, I usually run anywhere from around 12 to 14 pieces of interaction, and I just kind of leave it at that. We're not planning on really playing any of this interaction until around turn 6, when we untap for the first time with our commanders. So at that point, we should have hopefully drawn into some of it, in which case we can start the rest of the game. Now, the reason we don't worry too much about interaction and we have a little bit less is that our opponents are doing the same exact thing. Our opponents are also trying to set up their ideal board state in these first 4 to 5 turns, which is why we build our decks this way in the first place. Especially if you know your table, you'll know if a formula like this is going to work well for you. Now, if your table is a battle cruiser table, or they don't like combos, or they don't even like aggressive stuff, they just want to play casual, a format like this might be a little bit too streamlined for something like that. But if your table likes to play high power casual, a formula like this for building your decks is going to be great, as you're going to get there pretty consistently. and there's not going to be very many times that your table is going to cast a board wipe on turn 4. Now, of course, that's certainly possible if you're popping off really fast, but that's where you as a Magic player should make sure that you're playing consistently for these first couple of turns and not raising any suspicions. The goal is to be consistent, not to pop off as fast as possible. Now, we've only covered the first 5 turns in this kind of cycle. Now, we've only covered the first 5 turns in a deck like this. What happens after we cast our commander? Well, in most cases, if you're going to have some higher mana permanents that you're going to cast afterwards, they need to be really good payoffs for the rest of your deck. Going back to Ikra Prava, I have things that are going to either make us a ton of tokens, like Call of the Coppercoats, Illustrious Wanderglyph, Tindershoot Dryad, and Wolverine Riders. I have plenty of life gain payoffs, as well as a combo in Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond. Both are great for my strategy as I deal a lot of damage, gaining a lot of life, but I also gain a lot of life, dealing a lot of damage. Then I have Tevesh Zot, which is kind of a board state in a can. You can make a ton of tokens, or if you already have a board state, you can draw a bunch of cards. And then lastly, I have Aura Shards, which is super effective on the rest of the table as we make so many creatures that we can just take care of the rest of our opponent's board states. Now, of course, these are the higher mana payoffs. This doesn't factor in the fact that you have still the rest of your deck that is also high value and high impact cards. So playing those are going to be just as impactful. But those high mana, high cost spells that you're going to play after you cast your commander need to be so much more impactful in order for it to be worth it. And that's basically it. This is how I have been building the last couple of decks I've been brewing up, and it's seen a lot of good results in real life as well. The thing I love chasing in Commander is consistency. This format is the exact opposite of consistency. That's kind of the point. A Highlander format with 99 cards. And not only that, but you can choose to be thematic and fun, like having a Snake Tribal deck, while also still making it as consistent as possible. Having fun and power all in the same deck. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys think about this kind of formula in the comments below, and I'll see you guys all next time. I want to take a moment now to thank my patrons. Thank you guys all so much for your continued support. Thank you to Red Toter, The Lasocrat, George Vazanellis, Chris Smith, Ruby Storm, Raphael DDL, Hayeo, PG Star, Zedok, Abrax, Pedro de Oliveira, Rylan West, Hoop Light, and Noah Crete Woodhouse. Thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you guys next time.